Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome everyone to our Motivational Monday podcast, a journey of hope and recovery of substance use disorder. My name is Joe King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Lisa Zimmer.
Hello.
Hi, Lee. How are you? We are peer recovery specialists from the Southwest Council. Today, we are going to discuss the importance of eliminating stigmatizing language surrounding substance use disorder with our special guest, Chris. Hello, Chris. We want to thank you. Thank you so much for, joining us today. Don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Lisa, for having me. My name is Chris Golding. I am a project director at a nonprofit recovery community organization based in Philadelphia. I am a certified recovery specialist, a certified family recovery specialist, and a national certified peer recovery support specialist. And most importantly, I am a person in long-term recovery.
Nice. It's awesome. Well, we are glad to have you on, and let's rock this thing here.
Let's do it.
We appreciate it so much, Chris. Thank you. So today we're discussing the stigmatizing language that surrounds substance use disorder. On an individual level, stigmatizing words or actions are harmful, but collectively and over time, they have an even greater impact on people's health and well-being. For our listeners, can you just take a minute to define the word stigma?
Absolutely. So how I define stigma, and there's many definitions for stigma, but it is a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person or group of people, right? So, with that definition, like the stigma of having a substance use disorder will always be with me, or the stigma of being a convicted felon, or the stigma of having been incarcerated will always be with me. And I, early on, I thought that definition was a little abrasive, but stigma is abrasive, right? It's a harmful thing that I think that definition suits it very well.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, yeah. Okay, so let me ask you this. You hear the phrase, once an addict, always an addict, and the words like junkie, crackhead, pillhead, boozer, and drunk. Many people in society, today think that language is okay to speak that way. However, the words can be, incredibly, harmful, and hurtful. But, to people with substance use disorder, what do you think what's your thoughts about that? What do you think about that?
So I am not okay with any of those words, nor do I think anybody in recovery, should have to be okay with those words. Any term used like that, it identifies a person's entire being by that one word, right? And I'll even go a step further and with words like addict and alcoholic, right? Like those words they're very empowering in specific, in the right place, right? In 12-step mutual aid meetings, the word addict, the word alcoholic, it's a very empowering thing, right? And it almost creates an identity for a person, right? And for them being there. And I was a little torn on that because, my recovery initiated in a 12-step fellowship for my first couple of years. And since then it's evolved and it's grown a little bit, but I was torn when I first learned that words like that could be stigmatizing. But on a community level, if I'm identified as an addict, an alcoholic, a junkie, a crackhead, or any of those things that you just listed, that's my entire being, right? Rather than, I'm no longer an employee, I'm no longer a son, I'm no longer a brother. It erases a part of my identity, right? Whereas using person first language, where I'm a person with a substance use disorder, I'm a person with an alcohol use disorder, I'm a person with an opioid use disorder, I'm a person first, right? And all of those other things are still a part of my identity.
Yeah, I have to say, also, I'm a person of long-term recovery, and when I was in active addiction, I was okay being called that. I called myself that. I called myself a junkie. I was okay with that until I got in, got clean and started doing some work on myself. I realized, like, that's not who I am. That's not what you know what I mean? So yeah, I get it. That those words are just so harmful and hateful.
Yeah, and there's a lot of biases attached to them, right? And biases that a lot of people might not even realize that they have, right? Just by using words like that, it's and then there's other words like substance abuse rather than substance use, right? But like the term abuse itself it's attached to violence or anger and all these other negative connotations that are attached to that word abuse, right? So it makes a person with a substance use disorder automatically perceived as being a violent or angry person rather than a person that's experiencing a disorder that needs support to achieve their wellness and well-being.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You comment on that, Lisa?
No, I actually wasn't going to comment on that part, but I will in a second. I have noticed I am also a person in long-term recovery, and use those words for a really long time. Even well into my recovery, did I use those words, and even now. When I'm going through a time where I'm particularly feeling down, I'm particularly feeling bad about myself, because just because I'm in recovery, it doesn't mean that I don't have those moments. I certainly do. I handle them differently now, but I have those moments. And I look back on my past, sometimes I still use those words to talk about myself, but it's almost only when I'm feeling down about myself, when I am feeling shameful for some reason, do I speak about myself that way. But when I'm feeling healthier, when I'm feeling like I am in a better place, I tend to speak about myself in a more respectful way. So it also shows how we take that into account, even when we're speaking about ourselves,
And that's really interesting, right? Because reframe, like this is the conversation we're having, right? Reframing language. Like, if I'm working with somebody, right? If I'm working with a participant that is either in or seeking recovery or whatever that person may be, like one of the things that we're working on is trying to reframe those thoughts and that self-image, right? And I think changing the language, just like you said, right? Like when we're in a positive mindset, we're using that more positive language about ourselves. It's so important.
Yeah. So what I want to ask you next is, how does stigmatizing language affect someone who is actively using? And do you think that it can keep people who are actively using and create fear in getting treatment?
So while I think that it is also a fact that happens, right? So I don't have it pulled up in front of me, but I know the last time that I did a presentation or had this conversation, SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health, Administration, which, there's been a lot of petitions going around to change that abuse word to the use word. But the last time I looked at it, it was somewhere around, it was like 39.4, 39.6. It was somewhere around that 39-40% range. Stigma prevents 39 to 40% of people from seeking support, right? Whether that support is treatment, whether it's, community supports, whether it's reaching out to their family, whether it's going to a mutual aid group, whether that's AA, NA, Smart Recovery, Recovery Dharma, All Recovery in their community. It prevents a lot of people from doing that. And then also along with that, right? Like there's also a lot of stigma to, so the question was not using, for how does the stigma affect people actively using substances, right? There are people that identify as being in recovery that still actively use substances, right? Like, so we know this in our recovery community, that recovery is not a one size fits all thing. And those, I did pull these numbers up, and these are rough, but there was a research study done, I think it was in 2017, and at that point, of people in the community that identify as being in recovery, it was around 59% were completely abstinent. It was a little over 17% that were abstinent from their most problematic substance. And then there was almost 24%, I think it was 23.5 or 23, something like that, that were not abstinent at all. And they practice moderation and harm reduction and things like that. And that goes back to, which I should have referenced in the first question when we were defining stigma, the definition that I use for recovery. It's from the Recovery Science Research Collaborative. And it is I have it pulled up here, so I have to look over to read it. Recovery is an individualized, intentional, dynamic, and relational process involving sustained efforts to improve wellness. Recovery is improving wellness, right? It's a deliberate process to improve our wellness. So if person A improves their wellness by moderating their alcohol use, then by definition, they're in recovery, right? But that stigma of calling that person a drunk or an alcoholic or whatever it may be, when they might not need that abstinent-based support, but that stigma still follows them, right? Does that make sense how I'm explaining that?
No, absolutely, 100%. Like, and it's funny because you were saying that even with trying to change the language, SAMHSA, from abuse, to like use, right? And when we first started this podcast thing, me and Lisa, I'm on 6 podcasts ago. So we're going 6 months ago. That's how I would say, oh yeah, substance abuse. And she literally, if you notice on the sheet that you got at the top, it says in letter, oh no, she took it out now. That's right. You don't have
it's still bolded. If you look at it, it still has, bolded. Yeah.
Well, anyway, at the top, she had to put it in blue lettering. So because I had to get that out of my head. Now I don't even need it. It just comes out naturally. But doing it for so long, now I just say substance use disorder. And when I hear somebody else say it, I'm like, oh, they're saying it.
Yeah, I am.
They're not, you know what I mean? It's just the way they're saying it. It's that language,
Right, and I do. I sometimes I cringe when I hear substance abuse, and that is one of the ones that really kind of stings me really hard.
Yeah,
a little bit more than the rest of the language that we talk about. And I don't know why that specifically, but it sounds like you made a great effort, because I think we're all we've all done this, right? Like recovery is this progressive thing where it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving, and we're trying to do all this advocacy where recovery doesn't have to be hidden in the shadows anymore, right? It doesn't have to be confined to hidden parts of the community. So I think that progress is awesome. That's a measured rate of success, if you ask me, Joe.
Thanks. Well, Lisa, I thank Lisa for that, because she kept pushing it on me and come on, you got to start, you know what I mean? Like your language.
It's a great example. Lisa's advocacy paid off in your education on it. Yeah. That's a great case study 100%. Right there.
All right. So check it out. So how important is it to have the individual treatment facility use non-stigmatizing and respectful language? Could this impact enough to increase the chances of success for somebody that's in their facility looking at treatment?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, and again, treatment, community organizations, employers, probation, I think everybody across the board, right? The community at large. It definitely, and you mentioned the word respect, right? And I think, a lot of times people will use stigmatizing language without necessarily realizing that they are using stigmatizing language. So they might be using this language with great intentions and with respect in delivery, but not necessarily realize. And the person on the receiving end of the language might not realize either. But I think reframing it to that strength-based positive language is extremely important. And this pops into my head when we're talking about this. So the organization that I work for, we are part of this partnership of different nonprofits across the country. And when the pandemic hit, we started hosting these online all recovery meetings, right? So all recovery is basically just like a non-denominational approach to recovery. So it doesn't matter if somebody engages in 12-step or SMART or Dharma, or doesn't engage in any type of mutual aid. Anybody can come to these meetings and share on what's going on and find support, get connected with a peer specialist. And it was and what we noticed, a lot of people coming into that from different parts of the country, right? They got pretty big pretty quick because, the pandemic, the world's been locked down. So geographical barriers have been removed for attending mutual aid meetings. And one of these individuals, they came into the meeting and they actually emailed us later, because we have a contact email. If anybody wants to get connected with peer support, send an email, we'll connect you with an organization local to you. And this person said, and this is a loose quote, I don't have it word for word, but it was something like, it's so nice to be somewhere and be referred to as a whole person. That was powerful to me. That was very powerful, that this person came to the meeting and felt like they were being, their entire being was being seen.
Very powerful. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joe had asked about different individual treatment facilities and how important their language is. Going off that same thing, I know that when I was in a facility many moons ago, that for somebody, in order to come for our Saturday visitation, they would have to attend, a meeting or a class or an orientation, would you say, for a period of time before they were able to come and go on the visitation list and see people, right? So, do you feel like it's important that during that meeting that they discuss stigmatizing language, and should the visitors be provided with resources on how to speak about the individuals with substance use disorder? Do you think that that would be a good use of that time?
So I think that stigma in its entirety should probably be discussed in that, right? But specifically with language, because language is something that we're using nonstop, right? Like language is our communication. I also, Lisa, have been to I have been to many, many treatments where whether my family was coming to visit me or not, but I would see the families come in and go to these family groups, and a lot of times it would be about not enabling and not giving the family member money and things like that, which I think, at the risk of, calling out some treatment centers, I think kind of enforces stigma, right? Where like, but specifically with the language, right? Like, and specifically with family members, right? Because we're talking about family groups. We're talking about education for families that have a family member with a substance use disorder that is currently in treatment and either in or seeking some type of recovery from it. And if the family is coming to visit them in this treatment center, like chances are they're going to have a lot of interaction with this family, right? So they're going to see their family much more than the topic of substance use and recovery and mental health disorders and this and all the related things are going to come up much more with the family than they are in the community. So I think educating and providing resources about strength-based and person-first language could be a catalyst to a greater success rate of these people initiating their recovery from that treatment center or from that community organization or from wherever that education is taking place at.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. Okay, so in what other ways does negative language affect individuals with substance use disorder? Relationships, family members, law enforcement, employers, physicians, etc. You know what I mean? Like what does that, how the negative language, with the individual with substance use disorder, how does that relate with that?
So again, right? Like, so we've talked about the words junkie, crackhead, boozer, drunk. Like we've talked about all those things. So, I mean, for example, if somebody has a run-in with a law enforcement officer, and this law enforcement officer has it in their head that this person is an addict or a junkie or, living in Tent City or living on Skid Row, there's those internal biases that individuals have, right? That I have had in the past without realizing I have them, right? These words can almost create an inferior and superiority like complex between the two. Employers is an interesting one. I actually have worked on a project, and I've assisted working on a project for creating recovery-friendly workplaces in and around the Philadelphia and Pennsylvania area, and that project was going into local businesses that signed up to become a recovery-friendly workplace and giving them trainings on recovery, right? And and it would be, it could be start out as basic as what is recovery 101, how to be recovery friendly and how to be all inclusive to people that are in recovery. But one of the biggest things that we would talk about in that was language. And it would be, we would work with restaurants that might not necessarily think they could be recovery friendly because they serve alcohol and things like that. But it's just not the case, right? Like, as people in recovery, we're not, like, we can be fragile, right? But we're not going to break if we bump into a case of beer. At least for the most part. I can only speak to myself on that, right? I don't want to speak for the recovery community as a whole. And I would really take it back to identifying people as a person, right? I'm a person in recovery. I'm a person that has experienced a substance use disorder or whatever mental health or disorder it might be. You mentioned law enforcement and you mentioned doctors, I believe. Is that right?
Yes.
So I actually,
yeah.
So I have two personal life examples that I can use with us. So prior to me initiating my recovery, I had a lot of run-ins with law enforcement. Spent a lot of time incarcerated, and that was a part of my path, right? And
Right.
I remember, I distinctly remember, and I don't remember many things all the time, but I distinctly remember this one event where I was in a courtroom, and there was a person that went up to see the judge before me. And this person was living in another state for a long time, and it was a really old charge that he was facing, and he had a lawyer there with him, and they were trying to ask for it to get reduced down to something else, and it was this whole thing. But the charge was from the late 90s, and this was several years ago, right? But it was old for the time. It was from the late 90s, and this person, had said, I've been, I've recovered. I'm not living the life that I used to live. And the reason why I wasn't here is because I was living in another place, and I went through treatment, and I went through a recovery house, and I did all these things. And he listed out the whole last 15 years of his life and how things have changed for him. And I remember that judge looking back at him and saying, none of that impresses me. Once an addict, always an addict. And sentenced him to go to the county jail that day.
Wow.
And that jarred me, right? Because I was in there for a drug-related crime also, right? So I have to go in front of the same judge after I just saw that happen. But that jarred me. And like now looking back, I asked myself, like, had that judge had like a little more of a primer on recovery and stigma and things like language, right? Like, would he have had a different outlook on that? And I don't know the answer to that, but I know that the odds are, by educating communities, right, in all parts of communities, that there's going to be likely better outcomes. Now, when you ask about the physician, I also had a very, very positive experience with a doctor when I needed surgery. And this was several years ago. I needed a surgery on my knee. And I remember I went into surgery and I'm like, well, I'm in recovery. Like, I practiced abstinence-based recovery. I don't want any pain meds. Don't give me any pain meds. And the doctor, he's like, all right, well, like, look, like, let's see how everything goes. And, we'll talk about it on, when you come back. And I went back today for surgery, and he's like, I told him again, I don't want any pain meds. Like, I'll be fine. Like, don't do that. And he said, look, like, he said, I will write you a prescription for the, ibuprofen, so you can take that. He's like, but listen, he's like, because you're in recovery, he said, sometimes you need medication, right? And it doesn't mean that your recovery needs to change because of that. And this is a doctor telling me this, right? And I've never had an experience with a doctor like that. I've experienced some stigma with doctors before also. And he told me, he's like, he said, I'll write you this ibuprofen, but make me a promise that if, you're in pain and you're in discomfort and you're experiencing all these negative things, that you give me a call back and I can write you a prescription for what you need. And if you need to, we can talk about it. We can put a plan in place for how this could work for you. And that hit all the points of recovery for me. That doctor was collaborating with me on my plan. He was hearing me. So I was being heard, I was being seen, and he gave me options.
Wow.
Now that's recovery friendly, if you ask me, right? Like, that is an informed approach to recovery.
Yeah, 100%. Wow.
That's wonderful. I've had some similar positive experiences as well, specifically when I had a child, because that's painful. And it's up there on that really painful scale. And I had also, gone in with, kind of the same idea. And I did have a doctor that was also very recovery friendly. And it says being in recovery doesn't mean that you have to suffer. It just means that we need to put a plan in place to keep you safe. And so let's look at how we can do that. So it sounds like you had a similar situation, which is very good.
Very much so. And I'm glad to hear that I'm not the only one that's had that experience. That means that maybe there's more people out there that are having positive experiences like that.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's one of the most important questions. What are some ways that we can change stigmatizing language and behavior? And can you give us some example of words and phrases that can replace some of the common negative language associated with substance use disorder?
Absolutely. So changing stigmatizing, so it starts with the words we use, right? So, I mean, like my go-to examples for this, like in the beginning, we talked about like addict, junkie, druggie, crackhead, pillhead, and all that. And you know, we've referenced several times person with a substance use disorder, right? It's very simple. It's a blanket statement that covers all of, you know, everything below it. I've also heard terms like ex-addict or, you know, ex-junkie or things like that, right? I'm a person living in recovery, right? Or I'm just a person, right? Like, and that's the one thing, right? Like taking away like all those labels that we put on, you know, people in recovery. Some people don't want those labels. They don't even want to be referred to as a person in recovery. Those numbers that I gave you earlier about, you know, how many people are living in, you know, practice abstinent based versus, you know, abstinence from problematic substance and so on. There's a whole nother part of that study of people that are living in recovery, but they don't take that recovery identity. They don't identify as being in recovery. You know, some other things you'll hear is like, you know, a drug offender, right? Like I might have even just been guilty of saying that. We'd have to rewind to see. I don't know if I said I'm a drug offender or I was in for a drug charge. But I was a person arrested for a drug violation, right? And you see the theme, right? Like person first language. And then there are some other ones that I think are super important, right? This one is somewhat controversial in the community, right? But medication assisted treatment. I absolutely despise that term because what it does is it takes treatment for a substance use disorder and it separates it from treatment for any other disorder that somebody might have. If somebody needs insulin for their diabetes, if somebody needs chemo for their cancer, if somebody needs to take a blood pressure medication because they have high blood pressure, it is referred to as pharmacotherapy. They are on a medication to assist them in the treatment of what they are experiencing, right? You don't hear somebody that's going through, you know, chemotherapy as being on medically assisted treatment, right? No, it's called chemotherapy or pharmacotherapy, right? And then, you know, pharmacotherapy, it's a lot to say. It's a mouthful sometimes. You know, and sometimes I will say medication assisted recovery instead, or but it's just one of those things where we don't want to drive a wedge between people in recovery and the rest of the world that experiences different types of disorders, whatever that disorder may be. Substance abuser is one I don't like. Person with a substance use disorder. Like I said, and I'd like to echo, like addict and alcoholic, while in 12-step mutual aids, very, very beneficial and empowering to say that. Community at large, not so much. It kind of removes other parts of the identity. And that was one, the reason why I say it again, that was hard for me to swallow when I was in a 12-step fellowship. It was hard for me to understand that one.
Yeah, I get it. I mean, the whole 12-step fellowship, and with that, like, you know, how they identify, like me, you know, for myself, I identify as a recovering addict.
Yeah, and that's okay.
That's the way I, like, at the beginning, I'd be like, yeah, hi, you know, my name is such and such, and I'm an addict, you know, or am I, no, as I got into my, you know, into my recovery and my journey even further, starting to do some work on myself, I realized, no, I'm not that person anymore. I'm a recovering addict today. Yes. Yeah. You know what I mean? And that's what I identify with and how I identify. So.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I think where that, and and that's where, while I share that same identity with you, within those walls, and here in the community, even in my workplace, right? I work for a recovery organization, so that's, it's a little bit different.
At that point, I'm
I'm
always saying I'm a person of long-term recovery.
I'm a person in long-term recovery, right? And that long-term.
That's what I say, yeah.
And I was working with a participant one time. This is a couple of years ago, and the person said, "Well, when can I say long-term?" I say, "You can say long-term whenever you want. That's the beauty of it, right? Like you are in recovery when you say you are, and you are in long-term recovery when you say you are, and that's the beauty of it. It is a self-directed process.
100%. Like today, like you said, like I'll say, I'm a person of long-term recovery. You know what I mean? To where when I'm in the walls, in those four walls, and I'm in my own private group, then I say what I want to say. I'm a grateful recovering addict. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
But in the public, in the realm, in the workplace, I'm a person of long-term recovery.
Absolutely.
You know what, Chris? What I've heard as well, and I have seen some friction even within the recovery community between the terms recovering and recovered. I've seen a lot of friction between people. See, look at your face because you've heard it too. And it's the same type of thing, right? Like, this is your language. This is how you're choosing to describe yourself. But I definitely have heard people go after each other. You can never be recovered. You're always recovering. And it's like, well, if I say I'm recovered, I am. And you kind of go back and forth. So that is interesting language as well. And I'm assuming that you would think it's kind of whatever the person was comfortable using is what you would go with in that situation.
So yes, I am, I have a very person-driven approach, and we're dancing very close to the line of talking about stigma within the recovery community, because there is a lot of stigma that is, within our community of people that are in recovery, that stigmatize other people in recovery. And I think that that conversation could be a whole nother 3-hour podcast, right? Because again, and it all comes from.
So we'll call you next month too, and then we'll just do that one too, Chris.
Yeah, well, we'll get that one out the way.
Feel free. I am open to that. I think, what it comes down to, and this is with any stigma, right? There might be some malice to it sometimes, but I think most of the stigma that we see, a lot of it is a lack of education or a lack of awareness around how these words or how these actions impact other human beings.
Yeah. And I actually see in the recovery community that stigmatizing language in the recovery community, I've seen it take a turn. I've seen people that have been in recovery 20, 30, 25 years, 22 years, that are in that realm, and inside those walls that people would, first come in, when I first got clean years ago to now, it's like, I'm looking at, you see these people are saying, hey, oh no, you're on MATs, you can't do this. And there's that MAT language, and there's, right. And then
you also said got clean, which for some people,
So I
forgot about the clean and dirty thing. That one is very big for me too.
Exactly. But here's the thing. And then that turn, that twist is what I'm saying is now in 2021, you got those same people are like, no, they're allowed in here. This is an open meeting. They can, they're in recovery when they say they're in recovery. So, and it's been like maybe the last 5 years, I would even say 3, that has started to take a turn in the recovery community, that you see that language starting to change. You see other people that have been here, for decades saying, yeah, no, they're allowed in here. They can come in here.
Be more accepting.
They're clean. When they say they're sober, whatever. So.
Yeah, it's a lot to swallow.
No, 100%. I get it. But I let me see. How about this one? How can an individual respectfully correct someone that they hear them use the terms, use those terms for someone with SUD that might find it offensive? How can somebody with that
Other than bolding it on their piece of paper so that they remember what to say all the time.
Right, yeah.
That.
So how do you think they respectfully can say it in a nice gesture?
So I mean, by correcting them, right? And
That's it. That's it. Just by correcting them.
But I will say, right? So there is I do take temperature on situations, right? So and my staff, that I have a staff of peer recovery support specialists that work underneath of me that I supervise, and it's one of the topics that comes up, sometimes, where they might be working with somebody and the person they're working with isn't using, they're using stigmatizing language, or they're not using strength-based and person-first language. And it's been brought to me several times, like, do I correct that person, right? And my answer to that is, with a participant, when we're working with somebody that's inner seeking recovery, I think it's a very case-by-case thing, right? If we're working with this person and we're making progress in all these other areas, I might not correct that person all the time. It might not be a 10 out of 10 that I will correct a participant. What is a 10 out of 10, 100% of the time I will correct, is when I see other organizations that might be using stigmatized language, because I feel as if it's my duty to try and promote that education and to try and share that knowledge. Because again, a lot of times these organizations may not realize, they may not know, their website may have been from 20 years ago, and they haven't had an IT guy to come in and update their language or something like that. So in that sense, I will correct always on an organizational level. Person to person, in the community, because there's been times I was at the barber the one time, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, the meth head down the street," and I corrected my barber while he's cutting my hair. I know it was a weird dynamic, but I corrected him on it, and he thanked me, right? He said, "I'm sorry." He said that got away from me, right? Didn't realize what he was saying. He didn't realize, and I said, "Look, it's okay, right? Like, I am not going to run down and go buy some meth and smoke some meth tonight because you said that."
Right.
But it's just, and he said, "You're right, but it's a good lesson, right? I don't know who's around me, and I don't know who's listening."
Mm-hmm.
100%.
Yeah, that's a good point. Substance use disorder is an epidemic in this country, in our states, and certainly our communities. It's a disease just like any other and should be treated as such. And until we begin using language that reflects this, we will make little progress in reducing the stigma surrounding it. So how can we educate communities as a whole about the damage that stigmatizing language causes?
Well, I think we're doing it right now, right? I think exactly what we're doing right now. I mean, if this podcast reaches 5 people, 50 people, or 5,000 people, it's okay, right? If it's just the 3 of us and we have this conversation and this never gets seen, that's okay, right? Because I feel like we all learned a little something off of each other today, and that's a little something that we can carry on and that we can share with our networks, right? And then maybe somebody in our network carries that on, right? And I think that's the effect that, or that's the approach that we need to take with this. I always say, educate people, pass on facts, challenge stereotypes and myths, right? Because we're talking about stigmatizing language right now, but there's a whole lot of myths to recovery too, right? There's a whole lot of myths. There's a whole lot of myths with recovery, that we're broken people, and that people that have the mansion and 5 cars in the driveway and the family and all that they can't have a substance use or a mental health disorder, which is not true, right? So there's a lot of myths, and I always tell people, please do not feel guilty correcting anybody. Because ultimately you're educating the community around you, and by you educating, even if it's one person, that has the potential of that person educating somebody else, and then so on and so forth. And maybe, just maybe, one day we will be able to reduce stigma or eliminate it, right? And I feel like we're getting closer as time goes on. Recovery is a progressive thing, and there's a lot of good people doing a lot of good advocacy. But I think helping that one person or educating that one person could be the equivalent of educating 50 or 100 people.
I agree with you on that. And like I said, I've definitely seen and heard a change in that last, I would say, starting to, you know what I mean? And that's only really, like I said, in the last maybe 5 years, 3 to 5 years. So yeah, I've definitely seen a change, slight change. I'm not gonna say,
Absolutely.
but for somebody like us, we'll see it, we'll notice it. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Somebody like what we do every day, we'll notice that change. We'll see that change. But yeah.
For sure. And in the and it's been interesting, right? Because in the pandemic, I've my work shifted from being like Philadelphia and the surrounding 5 counties to kind of being like nationwide, because like we said, those geographical barriers they were removed, right? They weren't even reduced; they were absolutely removed. We could meet with somebody in Ireland if we want to do this podcast, or to have to have a recovery support engagement. And I realized, meeting with different organizations around the country, there's different language that people use, right? And I'm not talking about stigmatizing language, but just even it's just interesting, like hearing it. There's some organizations I work with on the West Coast where their peer specialists out there are peer mentors, right? And then you got up in like New England, they're called recovery coaches, and you have it's so interesting, like the different language in the recovery community, but it all being positive and strength-based, and ultimately going towards the same goal of trying to reduce that stigma around substance use and mental health disorders.
Yep.
All right, Chris, you now have the floor. If there's anything else that you want to say or you think it's important to share, go right ahead.
Yeah, so I want to thank both of you for having me here. This is a blast. I think we were a little bit worried about how much time this was going to be when we started. And I think we're good to go on having a pretty good length podcast. But no, I want to thank both of you for having me on for this topic. This is a topic that's very close to my heart, and I really, anytime I have an opportunity to talk about, discuss stigma or language with anybody, I always welcome that opportunity. So thank you very much. And I really hope that maybe one person hears this and hears something that, maybe clicks in their head about, the way that we speak around substance use and mental health.
Well, I would like to thank you too. I mean, it's nice to finally put the face with the name, and we've talked on the phone a couple times, some emails, but this is, I really appreciate you coming out too, and coming on here and doing this with us. It was a blessing. Thank you.
Yeah, and Chris, also, you have a whole lot of knowledge about a whole lot of different things. So I have no doubt in my mind that we're going to be calling you up and asking for you to speak on different things, not only on our podcast, but other sectors of our organization as well, because I think that, you have a lot of really important things to say. And I thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your passion with us.
Thank you.
If you or a loved one is in need of recovery support, please call us at the Southwest Council at 800-856-9609 and dial extension 322. Again, that number is 1-800-856-9609, extension 322. Due to the pandemic, you may have to leave a message and a peer recovery specialist will get back to you as soon as possible. You may also reach out to us on our website at www.southwestcouncil.org. If you feel the need to speak to someone right away and it is outside of our normal business hours, please call the National Addiction Hotline at 800-662-HELP. That number is 800-662-4357. And of course, if you are in need of immediate assistance and you feel you may harm yourself or others, please call 911 or go to your nearest emergency room. All right. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you again next month for our next podcast.
All right. Bye, Lee. Bye,
Bye.
Yeah.
Take a walk down the river tonight with a lot that's on my mind. There's some things I could say to you.